We are at the Hyatt this morning at the UN's Big Data Forum, and we are going to get right into the program this morning, the day's proceedings, as it were. Allow me to introduce at this time Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh and Rueanna Haynes. All right, so these are my first guests. Now, Mr. Kumar Singh is head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit, Ministry of Planning and Development. He is an experienced environmental diplomat and a prominent figure in the field of international climate change negotiations and policy. With a distinguished career spanning several decades, Kishan has earned a reputation as a visionary leader and influential advocate for climate action. Mr. Kumar Singh, good morning and thank you for coming this morning.
Good morning and thank you for having me.
And let me just tell you all, this is just a little snippet of the gentleman's resume, all right? So just to tell you that, we do have Rueanna Haynes, Senior Legal Advisor at Climate Analytics. Rueanna is an international climate law and governance specialist and TEDx 2020 speaker with over a decade of experience in the UN climate process. A former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat, Rueanna has negotiated for the Caribbean community as well as the Alliance of Small Island States. Rueanna, thank you very much for coming this morning, and that's just a snippet also, all right? So let's get right into what we have to discuss this morning. So what role do you believe the Caribbean region plays in international climate discussions, and having been deeply involved in the UN climate process from your respective roles and positions? Are the concerns of small island states adequately represented and addressed in these forums?
Well, the Caribbean region is characterized by small island states and low-lying coasts, so that makes it very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and therefore the voices of the Caribbean need to be heard globally in terms of what needs to be done to address climate change. So the Caribbean community, for example, has been advocating over the years for very stringent and strong action on climate change to prevent any adverse impacts that will undermine developmental objectives in the Caribbean, for example. The CARICOM region negotiates internationally through the Alliance of Small Island States, and we have been very influential over the years. We have, for example, in the Paris Agreement, through advocacy by the then Minister of Environment of St. Lucia, for getting in the 1.5 target in the Paris Agreement when it was being set at 2 degrees. Now you only hear about 1.5, you don't hear about 2 degrees anymore. So the Caribbean region and its voices have been heard and continue to be heard as we advocate for strong action on climate change.
Yeah, and before I go to Rueanna, I think that there may be a perception because countries are so small that our voices are small too, and there is a concern of how serious when we speak, how serious we are taken.
But there is strength in numbers. Under UN negotiating normative rules, every country has the same voice. So the largest and most developed OECD country has the same voice as the least developed island state, for example. And under that premise, I think we have taken advantage of that approach to let our voices be heard. So there's strength in numbers, and the Alliance of Small Island States, for example, collectively takes the views of small islands and CARICOM region into consideration when we advocate and we negotiate at the international level. And we have been largely successful in advocating for the needs of the region, for small island states by extension, and generally have had some success in that area.
Yeah, and let's speak a little bit about climate change, because up to recently, just a few years ago, climate change was denied. People didn't think of, well, they didn't think that it was something real. And in recent times, we have seen a number of things happening re the environment. You feel now that there is a greater understanding of climate change and the impact it is having on countries worldwide?
Definitely. I think what we're seeing now is that, well, it's two things actually. First of all, we're experiencing impacts in a much more extreme manner than had been expected. And this is even based on what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying since 1992. We knew that at that time, they knew that the climate was going to change. They knew that something was happening. They knew that we would be in a situation where temperatures, the average temperatures, would be increasing globally. But I think as we have seen technology progress over the years, they've been able to say in a much more specific manner what exact impacts will be happening, where they will be focused. And what we understand now is even what they predicted and modeled at that time was too conservative based on what we're experiencing now. So the impacts are actually, they've actually been a bit more extreme than expected at this time, and they've been coming a bit earlier. So we're actually in, I would say, a more difficult situation than we had expected to be in. And that is having an effect on, well, I guess the level of global recognition of the problem. As to whether or not it's having an impact on how quickly we move in the global negotiation process, well, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, hasn't it been a situation of, as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, you have to burn to learn, right? And I think because we're seeing the effects of it now, well, we are waking up.
Waking up, I would argue that we haven't yet started burning. And this is maybe what is the biggest part of the cautionary tale. Even what we are experiencing now is a tip, just a tip of the iceberg in terms of what we know is coming down the line. And the way the global climate system works is that there's always a delay in terms of the emissions that the atmosphere sees and the impacts that we feel. So what that means is that the actions we take now will not necessarily have an impact on what we're experiencing now, but will have a major impact on what we will be experiencing in the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Wow. Kishan, as someone with such vast experience in environmental diplomacy, what do you see as the unique and most critical challenges the Caribbean faces concerning climate change?
Well, certainly climate change impacts will be an overlay on the already existing challenges in the Caribbean region for sustainable development, for example. Because climate change touches every aspect of human development. It touches the biophysical environment. It also touches, more significantly, the socioeconomic aspects of development. So the challenges not only speak to those developmental challenges, but it also exacerbates the existing challenges of small islands because you have limited land space, for example, limited human capacity, limited financial capacity, limited technological capacity. And if you overlay the challenges of climate change, which speak to every facet of human development, then you can get a sense of how daunting the task is. Overlaid on that as well is that the Caribbean region is one of the most indebted regions in the world in terms of its foreign debt and which continues to rise, and the ability to pay that back, which is serviced by economic growth and development, which in itself is challenged by climate change. So you can see it's a vicious circle. All of these things have positive interactions. And therefore, the Caribbean region is classified as one of the most vulnerable in the world.
Yes.
And therefore, to address climate change properly, it not only takes a bottom-up approach to build climate resiliency at the national level, but it also takes that advocacy at the international level, where you have global efforts, collective global efforts, to actually mitigate against the impacts of climate change on the one hand, but also to reduce emissions to, as Rueanna said, to reduce the impacts that will come in the future, because if we were to snap our finger and the world were to shut down at this moment, and not a single molecule of greenhouse gas that causes climate change would ever to be emitted, we will be committed to changes in sea level rise, changes in precipitation, changes in temperature, because of the past emissions. And that is the level of challenge.
About or speak to our preparedness?
The preparedness has to be an iterative, continuous activity. And built into that preparedness is the challenges that come with the projections, because now we are seeing the rate at which climate change is happening has been underestimated. I think Rueanna made the point.
Yes.
And so a continuous assessment will tell you that if it has been underestimated, it means that our preparedness now has to be ramped up. continuously, and that adds to the challenge from a financial, technological, human capacity perspective.
Yeah, and Rueanna, coming from your legal background, have we in Trinidad and Tobago and regionally developed and implemented and monitored the requisite key legal measures to improve our responsibility and resilience to climate change?
I would say that it's definitely in train. As Kishan described, it is an iterative process. So the level of preparedness and the policy and legal instruments that exist within a state do not exist in isolation. They exist in relation to the overarching legal environment at the international level. And we know that we've only had the Paris Agreement in place since 2015. It entered into force in 2016. There's been 7 years in between. There's always a bit of a policy lag in terms of when you have a global agreement in place and the length of time it takes for states to implement the policy and enact the legislation in order to implement it. So, for example, I know that we have a few acts throughout the region that address climate change issues from different perspectives. In Dominica, there's a Climate Resilience Act. In Bahamas, they have an act looking at structuring carbon markets and regulating carbon markets. In St. Lucia, I think today they might be enacting specific climate change legislation in order to be able to implement the Paris Agreement. I know that Kishan has done some work in Trinidad and Tobago looking at draft legislation that would govern the implementation of the Paris Agreement in Trinidad and Tobago as well. So what we are seeing is that there is a lot of movement in the Caribbean from a legislative standpoint in order to be able to implement the Paris Agreement and respond to the rules that have now been established at the international level. And this work is on the basis of existing policy instruments, and there have been policy instruments in place in the region for some time dealing with different aspects of the problem, whether it be adaptation or disaster risk reduction or any other area that's related to resilience building.
Yeah. Kishan, and I want you to help me with this. I hope I pronounce it correctly. There's an agreement called the Escazú Agreement. Yeah, I got it right?
You got it right.
All right, good. So can you tell us, let's speak a little bit about this agreement and how it serves the interests of the Caribbean specifically.
Okay, so the Escazú Agreement,
yes,
as the name implies, was adopted in Costa Rica in a place called Escazú,
yes,
in 2018. The correct name of the full name of the agreement is access to information. It's an environmental agreement, a regional environmental agreement for Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's access to information, participation in decision making, and access to justice in environmental matters. And it is the first agreement that actually provides for explicit mention of the environment as a right, the right to a healthy environment, as well as environmental defenders, which is a first in the world. It is the only agreement to come out of the Rio +20 Sustainable Development Conference. And what it speaks to is really one in which rights of citizens at large are raised to prominence so that their voices must be heard in any decision that is being taken. They have to be guaranteed their rights in terms of environmental participatory decision making and justice in environmental matters. So how does this nexus with climate change, for example? Climate change is increasingly becoming to be seen internationally as a human rights issue. So the Escazú Agreement, with all its provisions, basically serves to reinforce the need for everyone, every citizen, to be involved in the decision-making process, consistent with the human rights norms that have been established, including the right to a healthy environment, eradication of poverty, things like that, right to education, and so on. So the Escazú Agreement really serves as a supporting instrument for addressing and achieving some of the environmental and climate change objectives that we all aspire to in the Caribbean.
And Rueanna, when we speak about climate change, we immediately think about hurricanes and weather events. Have there been, you think, successful strategies that we have adopted in the region to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Well, to mitigate, or I guess to build resilience,
yes,
and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I would say yes. But I would say there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the realm of establishing climate services, which would allow us in the region to be better able to track, to predict, and to plan in order to ensure that we have the proper building codes, for example, in place in order to ensure that we have in place the early warning systems that we need to allow people to take measures to remove themselves from danger in order to allow us to understand where exactly the impacts are going to be the worst so that those people can be protected in those areas. So there have been some strides made. So for example, in Antigua and Barbuda, they've done a lot in terms of their building codes and planning in order to ensure that people can be prepared. But with that said, when we think about extreme weather events in the context of climate change, what we are seeing and what certainly we have seen in the recent past, in 2017, in 2018 hurricane seasons, is that these extreme weather events are getting to the point where it's actually difficult to even be able to respond to them. So that's not to say that there isn't still work to be done to improve our resilience, but for example, if we have Category 5 and some say Hurricane Dorian, for example, might have been a Category 5 plus hurricane, there's very little scope for adaptation or for resilience building in the face of extreme events that we had never even thought might be possible. Yeah. So what we're looking at, as well as the resilience building, as well as the adaptation, is needing to make arrangements to deal with loss and damage, which is what happens when we get to the soft and hard limits to adaptation. And that is a different kettle of fish.
Mm-hmm. Ishan, we're just about 2 minutes again, but a little birdie told me that you may be speaking about climate finance today. At the forum later on today. If we could just touch on that and just give us really what else can we look forward to at today's forum? What should be the biggest takeaways from the forum?
Okay, so there's no adopted or accepted definition of climate finance.
Yes.
But suffice it to say that any financial flows from developed countries to developing countries, bilateral flows, loans, for the purposes of building climate resilience or reducing emissions can be loosely classified as climate finance. Climate finance is one of the things that have been the confidence maker and the confidence breaker in the international negotiations. It has been a long-standing issue since negotiations began, but actually came to a hilt in 2009 in Copenhagen. Yes. With the pledge of $100 billion by developed countries for developing countries, $100 billion by 2020, which was never met. Actually, so you could understand how this now has eroded confidence in the negotiations. This goal expires in 2025, and a process has been set in place at the last COP26 2 years ago for negotiations of a new quantitative goal, climate finance goal, to be adopted next year in 2024. And so those negotiations are ongoing. We are hearing of the quanta of finance that would be required for developing countries for adaptation. It has moved very quickly in a matter of a decade from billions, and we're now hearing trillions. I think the UNEP recent report on finance has gone into trillions, and it will keep increasing with the accelerated impacts of climate change. So we hope that at the negotiations coming up in Dubai later on this month and into next month, that climate finance will be given the seriousness that it requires, and we can have hard decisions that will lead to tangible delivery of the kind of finance that are required by developing countries, but more so vulnerable countries, such as small island states and us here in the Caribbean. In terms of what can be expected today, using the theme of big data, I think given the complexity of climate change, because it encompasses everything, it encompasses the biophysical environment, the oceans, the atmosphere, the cryosphere or the ice-based ecosystems, the land, everything, social and economic well-being, the socioeconomics, for example. To project and to predict the changes in the climate and how we react to them requires the analysis of huge data sets and very complex data sets. and therefore big data and big data analytics and artificial intelligence, for example, we see are now playing an increasingly important role in how this a large amount of information that is needed to be assessed, can be assessed to redound to the benefits of not only predicting climate change and what the impacts are going to be, but certainly socioeconomic modeling on how human systems can now react and plan for these large impacts of climate change.
Kishan, Rueanna, thank you very much for coming this morning. We do appreciate the information that you have given us, and it has also been an education for, I suspect, all of our viewers. We thank you again.
Thank you very much for having us.
So we are going to a very short break. We are coming back.